I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor, and welcome to December's premium event. I'd like to give a special welcome to all of you joining us today by donation. Thank you for your support. Our guest today is Ken McLeod. Ken was among the very early Western students to study with Vajrayana teachers of the last century, most notably with Kalu Rinpoche, who taught in the Karma Kagyu and Shangpa Kagyu traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. Ken is an author, translator, and on the advice of his teacher, for many years taught his own students. Ken's most recent book is The Magic of Vajrayana. If you'd like to hear my podcast interview with Ken about the book, we've put the link to it in the chat. If you'd like to purchase the book, there's a link to do that too. Ken's earlier books have been used by teachers in his tradition as study guides. Reflections on a Silver River, for instance, has been used by Pema Chodron in her own teachings. You can learn more about Ken's work at unfetteredmind.org, which we've also listed in the chat. Ken's approach breathes life and heart into practices that many have found abstruse and recondite, which is why we invited him to speak with us today. This interview will last 1 hour. Before we end, however, we will invite questions from all of you. Please feel free to ask your questions by posting them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen at any time during the conversation. The event will be recorded and sent out in a follow-up email later today, so those who cannot join us will certainly have an opportunity to view it. So welcome, Ken.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's so good to see you. I should let everyone know that Ken is a friend of mine. We speak every few weeks or so. Ken, much of your life has been devoted to making Tibetan teachings and practices accessible to the cultural West. But before we begin, I'd like to quote a Tricycle article by Anne Klein, herself a Vajrayana practitioner, because I think she puts her finger on the challenge many encounter when adopting Vajrayana practice and ritual. So here goes. Ritual, writes Anne, can seem superstitious and in tension with our cultural deference toward reasoned logic. Ritual seems to ask us to believe things that we just don't believe in and to do things we don't ordinarily do. Why bow if you don't believe in what you're bowing to, or if you just don't feel like bowing? So Ken, you can comment on that. Anne goes on to explain why she does, or we can just jump into particular practices that people may feel are inaccessible to them. What would you prefer? Would you like to comment on that, or would you like to start with the practices that I had in mind?
I think it would be good to comment on that somewhat because, as you know, I pay great attention to vocabulary. And we very often, and I've certainly been guilty of this myself, aren't aware of the freight that we're bringing when we use certain words. The dictionary definition of faith at this point in the evolution of English is to believe in something for which you have no evidence. And faith and belief are often equated with each other. This, I think, is deeply problematic for most people. And they're actually, possibly without knowing it, they're carrying the freight of the Reformation with them when they think in those terms. And also all the confusion that arose in religion and the established religions with the advent of the scientific paradigm. So in The Magic of Vajrayana, for instance, I refer to an incident which took place back in 1971 or 72, when I first met His Holiness the 16th Karmapa. There were a small group of us. And at one point, he looked at me directly. And I can still recall that gaze. It was intense. And said, "You must have faith Nkala Rinpoche, is my teacher, whether you see him fly in the sky or kill a dog. And what I've come to understand from that is that it's an example of how teachers will use the language of poetry to convey, and what I understood from that message is that the faith has to come from a place where it doesn't change and doesn't rely on reason, which is very different from saying that for which there is no evidence. It's the evidence comes in a different way. It doesn't rely on reason. Now, this, for many people, is possibly incomprehensible because so many people have only reason, but we have many other forms of knowing. There's a lovely Nazir Din story of having a conversation with a friend, and it grew dark. And Nazir Din's his friend said, "Reach into the drawer of your on your right to your right, and you'll find a candle and matches." And Nazir Din said, "How do you expect me to know my right from my left in the dark?" And I use this as a kind of koan in a number of my retreats because it points to a different kind of knowing, something that's deeply in the body, you might say. And then the whole notion of believe in, I find also, I try to avoid that terminology because as you and I discussed one time, do you believe in gravity? Do you believe in love? Well, the answer to both of those is no. We don't believe in gravity. Gravity is just something that's there. We don't believe in love. If you've experienced love, you don't believe in it. And the same thing, but when you extend that and you say, do you believe in God? Do you believe in this and believe in that? You see that that whole notion of believing in something basically brings a conceptual framework and a kind of rigid conceptual framework to whatever you're engaging. And that isn't the way that you approach ritual in either in Buddhism, in the Tibetan tradition especially, but I suspect it's the same in the Theravadan and Zen traditions. That was a kind of long answer, but is that a good place to start?
That's a good place to start, and I can jump to something else I was meaning to ask you very much related to this. You spent a lot of time reading about the Protestant Reformation and the shift in emphasis to faith, to belief.
Yes.
And you said religion is based on belief, not practice, something like that.
Well,
what do you mean by that?
Karen Armstrong, this is Karen Armstrong, actually, in a book called The Battle for God, which is a history, a very detailed history of fundamentalism in the Abrahamic traditions. And I found it quite, I learned a tremendous amount in reading it. Among them, among many of the things I learned is that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have basically all gone through the same process in the evolution of the religions over the centuries. And there's far more that they have in common. Actually, there's more in common among the Abrahamic traditions than among most Buddhist traditions. And that led me to view Buddhism not as a religion, but as a collection of religions. Like Theravadan tradition is so different from Tibetan Buddhism, and so different from Zen, and so forth. But going back to the point here, Karen Armstrong also notes that in the wake of Martin Luther's insistence on interpreting or understanding scripture in the light of individual experience or understanding, rather than relying on institutional or priest authority. What he didn't realize is that most people understood the scriptures differently from the way he did too. And so we went from, or the culture went from one tradition of Christianity to Catholicism in the West, basically, to Catholicism and 300 or 400 different Protestant sects. They thinned out over the years, of course, but they're still a very, very large number. And one of the characteristics she notes is that Judaism and Catholicism retained the idea of their the religion being based in the practice, whereas in the Protestant tradition, its practice is important, especially the practice of Christian ethics in one's daily life. But it's far more based in what you believe. And we see this echoed quite tragically in our country today, where people believe whatever they want to believe, whether it's about vaccinations or about what happened in American history and so forth. And once something's based in belief, once people are emotionally invested in belief, it's extremely difficult for them to change their minds and for anyone else to change their minds, because they're emotionally invested in it. So they will interpret everything that happens in their lives and around them in a way that maintains their belief and strengthens their belief and reinforces it. And the result is that they become less and less able to respond to the exigencies of the world in a natural and spontaneous and open manner.
You know, the word belief is then very problematic when we're talking about Vajrayana practice and trying to translate it into our own idiom, because I can ask you, I was going to begin with guru devotion, and the questions that I hear asked among practitioners and also non-Vajrayana practitioners: am I to believe my teacher is the Buddha, that he is omniscient, that she is to be obeyed, not to be questioned? What about individual autonomy? So for instance, take guru devotion. What is it, and how do we understand that, and why are those questions maybe themselves a misunderstanding?
Well,
you know, because if we think in terms of belief, I mean, if I'm saying that my guru, and I identify my guru with the Buddha, what does that mean if I'm not believing that? How is it a practice and not a belief?
This question is actually what led me to write The Magic of Vajrayana. Mm-hmm. And I encountered Buddhism, or I met my teacher when I was in my very early 20s, and naive in all kinds of ways. And I had to work through this and many, many other questions, just as you're describing. And I'll be quite frank, it wasn't easy. And it wasn't easy for a number of reasons, and I'm not sure I can dissect all of them in the short time we have here. But one of the distinctions that I got from reading The Battle of God, this book by Karen Armstrong that I mentioned earlier, is the distinction between mythos and logos. In a very, very succinctly, mythos is what gives meaning to life. And logos is about how we navigate life. Now, in our culture, we are very, very long on logos. We're a little bit short on mythos. A lot of people question, what is the meaning of life? It's a question which I found that you can virtually not translate. You can't translate that question into Tibetan at all. It's a product of our culture, what the idea that life doesn't have a meaning or could not have a meaning. And there are places that it comes partially from the scientific evolutionary perspective, but there are other reasons as well. When you deal with things in terms of mythos, since you're talking about things which are very difficult to talk about, you tend to use the language of poetry and of metaphor. And in the Tibetan tradition, or in Tibetan culture rather, you move back and forth between these two worlds with great ease. Nobody has any confusion. But we are, for the last about 150 years ago, 125, was when most people felt that Western culture had lost its relationship, particularly Anglophone culture had lost its relationship with metaphor. And we see this, I'm talking about the end of the 19th century. And we don't navigate between these two worlds easily. For instance, when I was teaching the jewel ornament of liberation, Gampopa, quotation, quotes a quotation, says, when you must have faith so that when you are confronted by 300 soldiers with sharp weapons, you will not give up your faith in practice or in whatever he's talking about. And people said, why are they talking about soldiers? So I said, well, when was the last time you were confronted by 300 soldiers with sharp weapons? I asked this actually in a group discussion I had last year. And, well, I've never been confronted by 300 soldiers with sharp weapons. I said, you mean you sit in your meditation absolutely at peace with nothing bothering you whatsoever? And the woman I was asking said, you mean, oh, those soldiers? This is an example of speaking in poetry or metaphor, if you wish. And if you're going to practice Vajrayana, you have to learn to understand and be able to move back and forth between these worlds, because otherwise you get very, very confused, just the way you're describing. So when you take an empowerment, for instance, you step into mythic space. What happens in empowerment isn't something that's happening literally. You're acting out a drama. You're acting out a play. And it's a ritual. And through acting that out and being, doing the, following the meditations you're given during the empowerment, even just the simple gestures that you make during empowerment, this all plants a seed of experience, but it's taking place in mythic space. It's about what is truly meaningful to you. It isn't about how you navigate life at all.
Anne Klein's, I'm sorry. Anne Klein says it has more it's more akin to art or performance.
Yeah, we have to be very careful about the word performance for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. I think a drama, a play, and you're acting this out, but this is the nature of ritual. I mean, it's the nature of the Mass, as you well know with your Catholic background. That's a ritual in which you act out what happened at the Last Supper, sorry, and it becomes, it's deeply, deeply meaningful in the Christian tradition, because this is where you connect with the presence of Christ. And I don't want to get sidetracked onto all the interpretations of the Mass, for instance. So at the end of the empowerment ritual, you take this you make this promise, I will do whatever my teacher tells me to. It's part of the drama. It's not a literal promise. And that's a really, really important point. And if we translate that promise from the mythic or metaphorical language in which it's being expressed, what are you actually promising to do? You're promising and taking a vow to listen to and follow your awake nature. It's much, much deeper than a literal promise. Far, far deeper. And far more serious. Because this is what your life is actually about. Now, part of the problem is that Tibetan culture is a feudal culture. And in a feudal culture, what you have, you're given to by your overlord, and your relationship with that is to supply him with part of the harvest and the means to go to war, like peasants and so forth, to wield weapons, things like that. If it comes to that, this is what happened in Europe, feudal culture. And if you didn't obey that, then you lost your castle or you lost your field or whatever. And these two things overlap so closely that, and the high lamas in Tibetan culture basically operate as princes in that culture, that there's a lot of people get confused by that overlap. And this happened in Tibet to some extent, but it happens far, far more with Westerners because we're just not used to this way of operating.
What would it mean to navigate both, slip in and out of both worlds? So I enter this mythic world of meaning, and I hold my guru to be the Buddha, and then I slip back out of that, step outside that mythic space or ritual space. And what does this guru become to me? A spiritual friend?
No, I mean,
what are you navigating back and forth? What are you going back and forth?
You sit down to practice, and you mentioned guru devotion. Okay, let's take the Tibetan term in Tibetan is Lama Naljar, which means guru union. So I translate this as a teacher union. Okay, and what is this? This is the mind of the student and the mind of the teacher joining. It is, according to many, many teachers, the most important is the central practice of Vajrayana. And the way that you do this is you pray to your teacher. And this is, as I said earlier, this is what moved me to start writing The Magic of Vajrayana. Nobody talks about prayer. How do you actually do it? And it isn't a case of believing, oh, this is my guru, this my guru is Buddha, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's a somewhat childish approach, in my opinion. I remember I was at a conference with a small conference in San Francisco. Gaelic Rinpoche, Maizumi Roshi, a few other Tibetan, and Mahagosananda was there. He was still alive at that point. Babik and Western teachers, Asian teachers, and so forth. And we were discussing a whole bunch of issues. At one point, this issue came up, and Gaelic Rinpoche said very quietly, my teacher is Buddha. He didn't say a Buddha. He didn't say the Buddha. He said Buddha. And there was something in the way that he said it. He said it very quietly. His voice was very soft. But there's an astonishing power and depth in it. And you could almost feel the depth of his connection. with his teacher when he just said those few words. And so what do we do in teacher union practice or Lama Nalja? We're reaching out in prayer to what we don't know, what we haven't experienced, what we yearn to experience. And that yearning is extremely important. Every practice should come out of that yearning. And I instructed all of my students to, before they sit down, whatever meditation practice they do, feel that yearning in your heart that it led you to practice in the first place. Just sit with it for a few minutes. You'll find in that yearning, there's the essence of refuge and there's the essence of awakening mind or bodhicitta. It's in that yearning. And it's also faith. Because faith gives you the emotional ability to reach out to what you don't know. And that reaching out you do through the practice of prayer. Now, it's very frightening to pray that way. Because to pray that way, you let go of any idea that you know anything. And it's like walking out naked into a storm. You don't know what's going to happen, into the dark. But that's the essence of prayer. And it is through that that you form an emotional relationship with what you do not know. And that's the beginning. And you take your teacher as an exemplar of what you are yearning to know. That's what it means to regard your teacher as Buddha. This is what you want to know. But this is all mythically expressed. And then at the end of your meditation session, you dedicate and share the merit and so forth and all that. And then you take your teacher a cup of tea because he's thirsty. And now you're back into logos.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that was very well explained, Ken. Just a word about yearning. You're anticipating. We have lots of conversations, so you're anticipating other questions I have. But this yearning, if we listen to it, I've heard you say, the concerns about autonomy when I mentioned guru devotion or any of these ritual practices, which seems such a threat to our autonomy, or can. You're saying, and you have said, that in this yearning, if you listen to it and you follow it, you give up all control that you think you have over your life and the lives of others.
In Four Quartets, T.S. Eliot says, to know what you do not know, you have to go by the way of ignorance. That is, you have to acknowledge that you don't know it.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't know how to know it. And you don't know what to do. This is what I mean about giving up control. As long as you have an idea, I know what I'm doing, I'm going to do this and this and this, it doesn't go so far in this area of spiritual practice. Suzuki Roshi expresses it in a different way, talking about Zazen. Our practice is absolute confidence in our fundamental nature. It's the same thing. You sit and you have no idea what you're going to face when you sit.
Can you say something about how or what you think we're yearning for? Or is that something that each individual must answer for him or herself?
I do think people need to answer that question for themselves. I can say how I do it, not the answer that I have, because I don't think I can put it into words. As you know, and you know from our conversations, I experienced quite a bit of difficulty, especially when I was in the 3-year retreat. And afterwards, people asked me, why did you keep going? Why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you just stop? The question puzzled me terribly. because it had never occurred to me. And so I thought about it a lot, and I did a lot of exploration. You know, was I compensating for some problem in my past or something like that? And I couldn't find anything. And then I recalled a line from Rilke, Letters to a Young Poet. He said, he's writing these letters to a young man who wants to be a poet. And he says in one of them, if you can possibly live your life without being a poet, do so. But if in the small hours of the morning, there's a small voice in you that insists that this is the way that you have to live your life, then here is how you do it. And Stephen Batchelor, in the opening of, I think it's The Faith of the Doubt. This is my own paraphrase of it, but he put the idea in my head. Buddhism in its institutional forms provides very powerful answers to questions of the spirit. But sometimes the power of those answers overwhelms the stammering voice, which is asking the questions. And something that I've taken to heart is to listen, especially when I'm having difficulty, to the stammering voice that is asking the questions inside me. And it's an instruction I gave endlessly to people who worked with me. And you have to listen to your body and to your heart. You have to listen to the very, very depths of your being. And the only way you can do that is to grow quiet inside. And the more deeply you can grow quiet inside, you may begin to hear something of that stammering voice. And where it will lead you, I have no idea. And whether you should follow it, I have no idea. These are all decisions that you have to make yourself.
And just back, staying with Guru Union, because somebody just asked a question that I anticipated would come up, and it's a good one, and it's one that often is asked. Karsten Struhl asks, in the Smithic Guru Union, how do we protect against teachers who may take advantage of one's trust for their own, perhaps even unconscious, ego-driven desires?
If a teacher requires anything of a student in terms of financial, social, practical stuff that is outside the student's path of practice, unless there's mutual agreement, the teacher is stepping out of his or her commitment to awakening. Now, that happens to all of us in one way or another, and you have to decide. Is this such a stepping out that it causes you to lose faith and confidence in the teacher? If that is the case, and if for any reason whatsoever, you feel you cannot learn from this person anymore, you thank him or her for all that you received, and you take your leave. Atisha set the example for this over 1,000 years ago. Now, when we're leaving someone who has opened doors for us because of their egregious behavior, that's very difficult. I don't want to just make it sound easy. But if you come to a point that you feel you cannot learn, and it doesn't have to be an egregious thing, it may be just, oh, something's changed. I can't learn from this person anymore. then take your leave and find your way.
And this takes me to Samaya. Maybe you can briefly explain what Samaya is. And often we hear of students who are said to have broken their Samaya vows. But I remember you talking once about how it's a two-way street and the teacher can likewise break Samaya. And I've seen students cast out or reviled or shamed for breaking their Samaya vows. What is Samaya, and isn't it a two-way street, and isn't that often misunderstood not to be?
Earlier in this conversation, I referred to the promise one makes at the end of the empowerment. Whatever my teacher says, that I will do. You promise to obey your teacher. That's said in mythic space. It's not a literal vow. You follow?
Mm-hmm.
This is very important. What you're actually promising to do is to listen to that yearning inside and follow wherever it takes you. And that itself is dangerous enough for the obvious reasons. Now, when you combine this with cultural confusion and the way things operated and the way groups operate anyway, if you find yourself thinking, no, this doesn't make sense to me, etc., you can find yourself an outcast in a group very, very quickly if you aren't going along with the group think. Your teacher, a teacher may be someone who demands absolute loyalty and absolute obedience. This may not be the right teacher for you. There's a lot to be learned. I mean, in the Catholic tradition, and when you take vows as a monk, is poverty, chastity, and obedience. And I had a friend who was a Catholic priest who did not get along with his superior at all, but he followed that vow of obedience, even though he disagreed deeply, because that was the vow he made to follow Christ. And it's the same kind of thing here. So these are very, very deep and very sometimes extremely difficult. But again, this distinction between logos and mythos is very, very important. Some teachers, as we know, have hugely exploited their whole community, not just one or two people, but exploited their whole community to become famous or what have you, or to amass a fortune or what have you. Well, why did you join that community?
Well, Ken, I would say that you mentioned this earlier, the feudal setup. I mean, if you have somebody on a throne and while they may not say it, their students may consider that person high up on that throne enlightened. And people are down below and looking up at this mythic figure. And it doesn't just invite projection, it practically insists upon it. So the potential for abuse on the part of unethical teachers and students, since it's a dance they both do, is very present. And it's not to say that it's entirely flawed and needs to be thrown out, although some do say that. But it represents potential traps for both the teacher and the student. If you consider the elevated language around enlightenment, and the teacher, all of a sudden, as you have pointed out in the past, is no longer held to the standards that one would expect the teacher to hold themselves to. So, can you say something about the potential pitfalls of this setup? I mean, because you talked about very beautifully the union, it sounds mystical, frankly, the mystical union between student and teacher is quite beautiful. But there is danger, as always there is in life. But this particular setup runs counter to a Westerner's ordinary understanding of authority structure or how it might or should be, as long as they believe in a kind of democratic setup anyway. This is not a democracy, so.
I mean, I had to work through this myself, and it wasn't easy. there were periods in my life, in my relationship with Rinpoche, when there was a great deal of tension in our relationship. And there was one such in which I only knew two things. I was faced that Rinpoche was asking me to do things which I didn't feel right to me at all. And it was about, this wasn't anything nefarious, this was about how to teach. But given my situation in Los Angeles, just didn't feel right at all. And I had to, the two things that were important to me, one, I was not going to break my relationship with my teacher. And the other was, I wasn't going to compromise my own integrity. And so I had to sit and feel the tension between those two, because they seemed to be directly opposed. But when I really sat with it, I realized I found something else that I was holding on to. And it was the position of being in, it was being in the teacher's position. Well, that made things very simple. I just went to Rinpoche and said, you know, I'm going to do things this way, but if this means that I should give up being the teacher in your center, that's okay, I'll do that. It's your center anyway. So I just gave it back to Rinpoche. He didn't accept it. But that's what I was holding on to, and that's why I was experiencing the conflict. When I let that go, then a door opened. And there were several other occasions, and each one there was something I was holding on to, which I couldn't see. So I used the tension and the discomfort and the conflict, if you want to talk about that, to get at something that I was holding on to. That's how you work the teacher-student relationship. But there are other cases, and quite a few people came to me with problems with their teacher. And I would ask them to do this kind of thing, and they would come back to me with this. And I would say, okay, that seems non-negotiable. Then you, sounds like you're not going to be able to continue here. And they would say, no, I can't. And then I would help them leave in a clean way, because that is so important.
Mm-hmm. You know, Ken, we have, we're getting some nice questions here, and I'm going to try to get through all of them, but I'm trying to address things as they come up. Megan Mook has a question. By the way, Megan leads our Tricycle tours to India. I haven't yet met her, but I guess I'm meeting her now. And Megan writes, I read somewhere that you said that the Tibetan model won't work in the West. Can you talk more about what you think doesn't work and why, beyond a lack of fluency with poetic language?
Well, we know very well that Asian authoritarian models don't work well in the West. We've had plenty of evidence for that. We've had breakdowns in the Tibetan tradition, we've had breakdowns in the Theravadan tradition, we've had breakdowns in the Zen tradition when these authoritarian models are used as a basis for organization of institutional things in the West. They don't work well. We've learned other ways of operating. And so when you bring in something from another culture, you inevitably bring in all the thinking behind it. And some of that just doesn't work here. We don't live in a feudal culture at this point. So we can't go back to operating as if we do.
Okay. Joe Bernheim asks, how can a student come to understand if they yearn for and will benefit from a practice that is filled with ritual or a practice that is established on simplicity?
Well, this is where there are a couple of things here. One, you have to listen to yourself, and the other thing is you have to try things out. I fell into the Tibetan tradition more by accident than by design. My background is in mathematics, where my university training was. So the idea of forming quite deep relationship with Mahakala or Chenrezig or Green Tower or any number of others that I've worked with over the years, that would have felt very strange to the young graduate in mathematics. And it took me a long time to work out that relationship, but I am very, very grateful for it. On the other hand, it became very clear to me when I started teaching in Los Angeles that the people that I was working with led very complex lives, and they needed a kind of a simple approach to meditation, not an elaborate one. And so I had them rest with the breath primarily and learned and taught them how to take that as deeply as possible. And out of that, some of them, not all of them, developed a yearning or desire to go further or go into different areas of practice. And I would teach them accordingly. I think this individual working out a way that works for you in conjunction with your teacher, that's very, very important. Well, one of the things I'm acutely aware of is this, how so many people no longer have the opportunity to be able to talk substantially with a teacher and ask these kinds of questions and work these kinds of things out. The way that a lot of centers and organizations are set up, that just becomes very difficult, if not impossible. And I think that's a tremendous loss because I think it's really important.
Okay, Lorenzo Clemente asks, the teacher relationship comes down to intimate decisions, discrimination, and heart connection. At the end, it sounds like there is a deep dimension of aloneness. In your understanding, can the experience of life itself be a teacher?
Well, yes, it is a teacher. And when you take up a path of practice, part of that is learning from life itself. Every broken glass, every wrong turn I make is an example of I'm being taught that I wasn't paying attention. And those are very small things, but there are bigger things. Whenever we set out to do something and what happens is different from our intentions, there's something to learn there. There is a deep aloneness in the spiritual path. You're quite right. I've had to talk to many students about that and accepting that it is part of the path. Having a relationship with your teacher that does not depend on time and space is very important. Having a relationship with practice that does not depend on time and space is very important for that reason. So that your practice and your teacher and those who are close to you in the path, they're with you regardless of time and space. It's something that goes beyond the ordinary experience of life. And because in the end, spiritual practice isn't about how to live one's life better at all. It's about coming to have a relationship with life that does not depend on the conceptual mind at all. And for most people, that's unimaginable, but it is actually possible.
And I'm going to try to get two more questions in before we finish. Katerina asks, what would you say to someone who started the preliminary practices, or Nundro, and didn't finish? Can you still be a sincere and dedicated Vajrayana Buddhist?
Yes, you can. It's very difficult to start something and not finish it. There's a Tibetan expression, a proverb, perhaps better not to start, but if started, better to finish. But I've worked with many people who've been in that situation. And there's something to work through that because you formed an intention and you have not been able to complete it. But that's not an insuperable obstacle in any way. And that is something to work out with a suitable teacher who can guide you through that and support you through it. But yes, there's no doubt. Nothing is written in stone here. That's important. It's as in mythic space. Nothing's written in stone.
Okay. An anonymous attendee asks, Vajrayana practice appeals because of emphasis on direct experience in the body. Can you explain the benefit of grounding the body, for example, in the technique of earth descent, bringing energy deeply in the earth?
Into earth descent?
Yes, the technique of earth descent. I'm not sure that is, bringing the energy deeply in the earth. But maybe the first part, Vajrayana practice appeals because of emphasis on direct experience in the body.
Well, it's direct experience, and that involves the body. It's not just the body, but the body is very important. I don't know the practice of earth descent. I haven't heard that terminology. What I can say is that the instruction I usually give to students is not watch the breath. I say rest in the experience of breathing. When you rest in the experience of breathing, you're naturally going to feel your body, and you'll find yourself resting more deeply. Rest in the experience of breathing, and whenever you're distracted, return to what is already there. If you practice this way, as your practice matures, what is already there will change and will take you deeper and deeper. But rest whenever you're distracted, return to what is already there. That instruction will take you a very, very long way.
Okay, so we do have time for another question. We started a few minutes late. We still have some time left. Bev asks, isn't the individual path like the quest in indigenous ways? We just don't have it ritualized in our society, actually not allowed. In other words, is this similar to the quest among indigenous peoples? And do we not have in our own culture a ritualized way to, I would just put it this way, this is me, pursue that yearning that you described earlier?
Well, the latter part, yes, we do not have a ritualized way of doing it. In fact, we don't have a way at all. It's there's no transition from childhood to adulthood, no ritual transition from childhood to adulthood, which is why we have so many overgrown children running the country. And it's a problem, I think, in our culture. The people have tried to come up with rituals. I have a friend who teaches people who are guiding people in vision quests and things like that. He's got 30 years of experience doing this and quite a deep understanding of what's involved and the dangers, pitfalls, and how to negotiate them and the benefits that come out of it. The challenge, and this is where we started the conversation, basically, the challenge of finding meaning in our society is non-trivial because the materialism, and by materialism, I don't mean just acquisition, I mean regarding matter as what is ultimately real. The scientific paradigm, because the scientific paradigm doesn't have within it any meaning, it's pure logos. And forming a relationship with our lives. This is non-trivial stuff, and it's why many people have turned to various religious traditions and other traditions. This is all part of navigating life, and so we can't rely on cultural forms because we don't have them. And it's a bit like going out into the desert.
Okay, Ken, that's all the time we have.
That's
And
gone quickly. Thank you very much.
yeah, it was
I like the questions. They were very, very good questions. So please thank everybody for that.
great. Well, they're sending their thanks too. Again, a link to Ken's most recent book, The Magic of Vajrayana, is linked to in the chat. If you'd like to watch today's event again, we'll be sending out the replay in a follow-up email. A quick reminder, Tricycle is a nonprofit and relies on the generosity of its readers. You can always donate at tricycle.org/donate. And join us next month for Tricycle's annual meditation month. It's a great way to start the new year, and even better, it's free. Check it out at tricycle.org/events, and we'll also drop the link in the chat. Many thanks again, Ken, and to all of you who joined today. Ken, always a great pleasure speaking with you, and I'm sure we'll be doing another podcast sometime in the new year.
Well, my pleasure. Always good to talk with you, James.
Great. Thank you, everybody.